Any spines, and it didn't have any things sticking out anywhere. It was completely smooth except for like alligator skin looking stuff, a long nose on it.
It was just after midnight on a warm April night when the camera trap lit up. Deep in the pinelands east of Everglades National Park, a 4-foot Argentine black and white Tegu moved like it owned the place. It zeroed in on a fresh American crocodile nest, dug with powerful claws, and began methodically crushing and swallowing the eggs. One after another. The footage was clear, almost clinical. What the biologists watching back at the lab didn't know yet was that this particular raid might be one of the last of its kind in that stretch of wetland, because a few months earlier, they had tried something no one had ever attempted at this scale. The invasion had been building for more than a decade, almost unnoticed at first. Back in 2012, trappers in Miami-Dade County were catching fewer than 200 tegus a year. By 2017, that number had jumped past 1,000. Today, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and its partners have removed more than 10,000 of these lizards, yet the population continues to expand. These animals are not picky eaters. Stomach content studies from University of Florida researchers showed that in peak nesting season, reptile and bird eggs can make up more than 40% of what a large adult tegu consumes. They dig into American crocodile nests along the coast, raid gopher tortoise burrows that serve as refuges for dozens of other species, and hit the ground nests of wading birds already struggling with habitat loss and rising water levels. One dedicated volunteer who had been monitoring a small cluster of crocodile nests for 5 seasons came back in 2023 to find every single nest destroyed in a single week. He described it as walking into a battlefield after the fight was over. Picture the broader map. Tegus are now confirmed in 4 separate breeding populations across Florida, including a newer one in St. Lucie County that is creeping toward the northern reaches of the Everglades system. Models from the U.S. Geological Survey warned that without aggressive intervention, the lizards could eventually occupy much of the southeastern United States, where winters are mild enough for them to survive. The concern was not just the direct egg predation. Tegus also compete for food with native mammals and reptiles, and their habit of digging deep burrows can destabilize canal banks and levees that protect both wildlife and human communities. Every year, the leading edge of the invasion moved a little closer to the heart of Everglades National Park. If they ever established dense populations inside the park's freshwater sloughs and marl prairies, the cascading effects on ground nesting species could be felt for generations. Faced with that slow-motion disaster, a small team decided the usual tools were not moving fast enough. They had watched the sterile insect technique succeed against mosquitoes in the Florida Keys and against screwworm flies in livestock operations. The question they kept asking in late-night meetings was whether the same logic could be forced onto a large territorial lizard. In 2023, they began a pilot program to develop a safe sterilization method for male Tegus. Working with wildlife veterinarians, they refined a minimally invasive procedure that left the animals healthy and able to compete for mates, but unable to produce viable sperm. The first successful surgeries were performed on captive animals at a research facility near Gainesville. One of the early subjects, a big male the team nicknamed Big Stripe because of his bold patterning, recovered quickly and even gained weight after the operation. That small victory gave them the confidence to scale up. In the spring of 2024, they released roughly 2,000 sterile males into targeted zones along the eastern boundary of the Everglades, focusing on the transition areas between developed land and the vast wetlands. The strategy was to create a living barrier of infertile males that would intercept wild females before they could produce another generation of invaders. The project was controversial from the moment it became public. At a town hall meeting in Homestead, residents worried that the sterile Tegus would still eat the same number of eggs and might even spread the invasion farther if they wandered. Online forums filled with comments calling the idea reckless science. Inside the agencies, some senior staff questioned whether the money and political capital were worth the risk. Funding came from a special allocation tied to Everglades restoration, but it was never guaranteed year to year. On the ground, the work was exhausting. Capturing enough healthy adult males required hundreds of trap nights in brutal heat and sudden thunderstorms. The surgery itself demanded precise timing and post-operative care that stretched the small veterinary team thin. Early in the releases, a cold snap in March 2024 killed several of the newly sterilized animals before they could establish territories. Then came the first round of genetic testing on eggs collected from monitored nests. Fertile clutches were still appearing at rates higher than anyone had hoped. For several months, the data looked discouraging enough that quiet conversations began about whether the entire effort should be quietly scaled back or rebranded as a learning exercise rather than a solution. If you've been following stories about invasive species and the sometimes desperate measures people take to protect wild places, and you want to see how this one actually played out, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Because right when the project was starting to draw quiet skepticism inside the agencies involved, the data began telling a different story. Researchers had fitted a subset of both sterile and wild Tegus with small radio transmitters and deployed dozens of camera traps across the release zones. Late one evening in the fall of 2025, the team gathered around a bank of monitors to review months of footage. What they saw was not the clean, predictable pattern of sterile matings they had modeled. Instead, they watched wild males repeatedly abandon receptive females to chase and fight the newcomers. One clip showed a large wild male sustaining a visible injury to its flank during a prolonged confrontation, after which it disappeared from the area for weeks. Another sequence captured a female Tegu visiting multiple nest sites, but ultimately abandoning the attempt after repeated interruptions by sterile males patrolling the same stretch of pineland. When the genetic results finally came back in batches from the lab, the team realized that more than 70% of the clutches that were still being laid had been fathered by sterile males. Those eggs would never hatch. The infertility was real, but it was the behavioral chaos layered on top that turned a modest reduction into something far more dramatic. The added competition seemed to be triggering an Ali effect stronger than anyone had calculated, lowered breeding success at the population level, because animals were simply too busy fighting or avoiding each other to reproduce effectively. And then came another layer nobody had put into the original proposal. Because the sterile males carried no reproductive burden, they maintained better body condition through the breeding season and into the fall. Several recaptured animals showed they were actively preying on the few Tegu hatchlings that had emerged from earlier, non-sterile clutches. It was a small but measurable cannibalistic pressure that further suppressed the next year's recruitment. The combination of direct infertility, disrupted mating behavior, territorial fighting that injured or displaced wild males, and opportunistic predation on the remaining young created a compounding downward spiral. Population estimates inside the core 50 square kilometer release area dropped more than 78% between the spring of 2024 and the summer of 2026. In the same period, nest success for American crocodiles in the adjacent monitored wetlands rose by 35%. Gopher tortoise burrows that had been repeatedly raided showed fresh tracks and new occupants. Even some ground-nesting bird species that had been quietly declining began showing improved fledging rates in the treated zones. The economic picture shifted as well. Independent modeling by South Florida Water Management District economists estimated that every Tegu prevented from breeding or removed through enhanced trapping saved between $400 and $700 in future management costs and avoided ecological damage. Scaled across the treated area, the program is already projected to return several $1 million in avoided expenses over the next decade. The detailed movement data collected from the radio-collared animals has also rewritten how trappers prioritize their efforts elsewhere in the state. Instead of spreading resources evenly, crews now focus on known travel corridors and high-quality nesting habitat identified during the experiment. 2 new papers are in review describing the behavioral mechanisms that amplified the sterile male effect, and wildlife agencies in Georgia and Alabama have reached out for briefings on whether similar approaches could be adapted for their own emerging Tegu populations. What started as a controversial experiment has quietly become one of the most closely watched case studies in invasive reptile management anywhere in the world. The effect has persisted into a second full breeding season, suggesting the sterile population continues to exert pressure, even as some individuals are lost to natural mortality or occasional recapture. Managers are now discussing a measured expansion into the St. Lucie County population, using lessons learned about release density and timing. None of this means Tegus will disappear from Florida. Complete eradication was never the stated goal, and the animals remain established in multiple locations. But the sharp, localized collapse in breeding success has given native species a measurable window to recover, and it has given people tasked with protecting the Everglades a new set of tools, and a much clearer understanding of how these invasions actually unravel when you apply the right kind of pressure at the right moment. In the end, this story is not really about one clever technique or a single release of 2,000 lizards. It is about the gap between what we plan on paper and what actually happens when living animals interact with a living landscape. The models miss the fighting, the abandoned nests, the improved body condition of the sterile males, and the small but real cannibalism on the remaining young. Nature filled in those gaps in ways that made the outcome both better and more complicated than anyone had drawn on a whiteboard. It leaves us standing in front of a larger question that will only grow more urgent as more species move into new places. When an invader is reshaping an ecosystem we value, how much risk are we willing to accept in the search for solutions that might actually work at scale? And how do we stay honest enough to notice when the real results diverge from the plan we thought we were following? I'd really like to know what you think about that. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.